The year is 1605. A man sits alone in a small study in Prague, surrounded by 9 years of failed calculations. His eyesight is poor. His handwriting is cramped. His mother is about to be accused of witchcraft, and he is trying, one more time, to find the shape of Mars. His name is Johannes Kepler, and on this night, something clicks. He has been trying to fit Mars into a perfect circle, because everyone knows planets move in circles. Aristotle said so. The church assumed it. The math has never quite worked, and Kepler has been willing to try, again and again, to make it fit. But tonight, he tries something he has been afraid to try. He lets go of the circle. He allows the orbit to be oval, and suddenly, everything fits. He is not just a mathematician. He is a man who spent 4 years in theology before he ever touched an equation. He believes with absolute sincerity that the God who made the universe made it with structure, and that if you look hard enough at the structure, you will find the mind of the maker. He writes in his notebook, "I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him." That sentence is not humility. It is a conviction. Before we go any further, there is something you should know. One of the men in this story carried a secret with him for 8 years. He sewed it into the lining of his coat. He resewed it into every new coat he owned. And when he died young, exhausted, in a small room in Paris, a servant found something hard stitched into the fabric. We will get to that, but not yet. Here is what most people miss about the history of science. The story most of us were told, the one where science and religion have been at war since Galileo, is not the full story. Francis Bacon, the man who laid out the foundations of the scientific method in 1620, wrote this: "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion." He was not being poetic. He was describing what he had watched happen to the serious thinkers of his generation. The Hebrew word in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, is bara. You will not find it used anywhere else in the Bible the same way. When humans make things, the Hebrew writers use different words, craft words, builder words. But bara belongs only to God. It means to bring something out of nothing, not to rearrange, not to reshape, to speak reality into existence from a place where reality did not exist before. The men in this story did not think they were competing with that word. They thought they were reading the result of it. Back to Kepler. He was born in 1571, premature and sickly, in a small town in what is now Germany. Smallpox damaged his eyesight before he was 4. His father left the family to fight as a mercenary and never came home. He was, by his own account, an awkward child, brilliant, anxious, deeply pious. He enrolled in theology at the University of Tübingen Planning to become a Lutheran minister. Then he met a professor who quietly showed him a different model of the universe, the one Copernicus had proposed, where the sun sits at the center and the earth moves. And Kepler, instead of seeing a threat to his faith, saw an invitation. If the sun is at the center, he thought, then God has placed a lamp in the middle of his temple so that it can give light to everything at once. What could be more fitting? He never stopped being a theologian. He just changed what he was studying. For 19 years, he would map the heavens, defend his mother in court against a witchcraft accusation that stretched on for 6 years, lose 2 children, outlive his first wife, and keep calculating. He died in 1630, nearly penniless, still owed back pay by the government that had employed him. But the 3 laws he found describing the motion of every planet in the solar system are still in use today. Every satellite, your phone, talks to obeys Kepler's laws. Every space mission ever launched was plotted with equations that trace back to a half-blind theologian in a cold study in Prague, a man who was just trying to think God's thoughts after him. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day, 1642, in a farmhouse in Lincolnshire, England. He was so small at birth that his mother later said you could fit him inside a quart mug. His father had died 3 months before he was born. When he was 3, his mother remarried and left him with his grandmother. He did not forgive her for that for a very long time. None of that is what the history books lead with. The history books lead with the apple. You have heard the story. Newton sits under an apple tree. An apple falls. He discovers gravity. The universe is explained. The story is tidy enough to fit on a classroom poster. And like most classroom poster stories, it strips out everything that makes the real thing worth knowing. Here is what actually happened. Newton was 23 years old, hiding from a plague that had shut down Cambridge University. He had gone home to Lincolnshire with nothing to do but think. And for 18 months, in near total isolation, he did not just discover gravity. He invented calculus, the mathematics of change itself, laid the foundation for the laws of motion, and worked out that the same force pulling an apple toward the ground was also holding the moon in its orbit around the earth. Not bad for a 23-year-old in quarantine. But here is the part nobody tells you. Isaac Newton spent the rest of his life writing theology, not as a hobby, not as a Sunday activity. He wrote approximately 1.5 million words on scripture, on prophecy, on the nature of God, on the books of Daniel and Revelation. His theological output was larger than his scientific output. When scholars catalogued his papers after his death, they were stunned. Here was the man who had written the Principia Mathematica perhaps the most influential scientific document in human history. And he had also spent decades trying to decode the precise timeline of biblical prophecy. He was not embarrassed by this. He saw no contradiction. Newton wrote, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." He did not write that as a concession to the church. He wrote it as a scientific conclusion. He had stared at the machinery of the universe long enough that the machinery had started to look, to him, like evidence. Stay with me, because this is where it gets remarkable. The Greek word at the opening of John's Gospel is logos. In the beginning was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos was God. You probably know that word translated as the word, but in Greek philosophy, in the world of Plato and Aristotle, and the Stoics, logos meant something far more specific than a spoken word. It meant the rational principle behind reality itself, the organizing intelligence that held the cosmos together. Greek philosophers had been arguing about the logos for 500 years before John picked up a pen. And John, a fisherman from Galilee, walked straight into the middle of that 500-year argument and said, "I know what the logos is. I had dinner with him." Newton read that. He read it carefully, and he believed, all the way down, that the logos had left fingerprints on the universe, and that science was the discipline of reading those fingerprints. He died in 1727, at the age of 84. On his deathbed, he said, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now, and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." A man who had spent 60 years mapping the ocean, still standing at the edge of it, still amazed by how much shore there was left. Michael Faraday was born in a blacksmith's family in South London in 1791. His father was often too sick to work. There were days the family had nothing to eat. Michael received almost no formal education. At 13, he was apprenticed to a bookbinder, and for 7 years, while he stitched spines and trimmed pages, he read every book that passed through his hands. He read a chapter on electricity in an old encyclopedia and could not put it down. At 21, he talked his way into a lecture at the Royal Institution, took meticulous notes in a hand-bound notebook he made himself, and sent them to the scientist, giving the lectures a man named Humphrey Davy with a letter asking for a job. Davy hired him as a lab assistant. The other scientists at the Royal Institution treated Faraday as staff. Davy's wife made him eat with the servants when they travelled. He kept working anyway. In 1831, at the age of 40, Michael Faraday discovered electromagnetic induction. He found that a moving magnet could generate an electric current. Every electric motor on Earth, every generator, every power plant, every device that converts motion into electricity or electricity into motion operates on the principle Faraday found in his lab on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The entire electrical world you live inside right now traces back to that afternoon. But here is what you will not find in most textbooks. Michael Faraday was a devoted member of a tiny Christian sect called the Sandemanians, fewer than 1,000 members in all of Britain. They met twice on Sundays, read scripture aloud, washed each other's feet, and tried with complete seriousness to live exactly as the early church had lived in the book of Acts. Faraday served as a deacon, and later as an elder. He preached in a small chapel on City Road, London, to congregations of 50 or 60 people. On the same weekends, he was being celebrated across Europe as the greatest experimental scientist alive. He turned down a knighthood twice. He turned down the presidency of the Royal Society. He said he wanted to remain plain Mr. Faraday to the end. When asked why he believed what he believed, he said, "The book of nature which we have to read is written by the finger of God." He died in 1867 in a house provided by Queen Victoria, having given away most of what he earned. His headstone gives only his name and dates, nothing more. Now watch what happens next, because the next man in this story is in some ways the most extraordinary of all. His name is Gregor Mendel, and you have almost certainly never heard what his life actually looked like. Mendel was born in 1822 in a small village in what is now the Czech Republic. His family were peasant farmers. They scraped together enough money to send him to secondary school, but by the time he reached university, the money had run out entirely. He had exactly one option left if he wanted to keep learning. He entered a monastery, not reluctantly. He wrote later that the monastery offered him the opportunity to be freed from the bitter fight for existence. Inside the monastery of St. Thomas in Brno, something happened that nobody could have predicted. He started growing peas. From 1856 to 1863, over 7 years, Gregor Mendel crossbred approximately 29,000 pea plants in the monastery garden. He tracked which traits appeared in which generation: smooth peas, wrinkled peas, yellow, green, tall plants, short ones. He counted, he recorded, he ran the numbers again. What he found was this: inheritance follows mathematical laws. Traits are passed from parent to offspring in predictable ratios. There are dominant versions and recessive versions. You do not get a blend. You get a pattern. He had discovered what we now call genetics. The Hebrew word chokmah appears in Proverbs chapter 8. Wisdom speaks, and wisdom says, I was there at the beginning, before the mountains were settled, before the hills I was brought forth. I was beside the Creator as a master craftsman. I was daily his delight. The ancient Hebrews believed that the universe was not random, that beneath the surface of the visible world there was a deep ordering logic, a chokmah, a wisdom woven into the fabric of things. Mendel, kneeling in the dirt of a monastery garden, counting pea plants he found it, not a metaphor, an actual mathematical structure, underneath the surface of living things. He published his findings in 1866 in the Proceedings of a Local Natural History Society in BRNO, a journal so obscure that barely anyone read it. For 34 years, nothing happened. Mendel died in 1884 tired, a little frustrated, surrounded by his monks. He never knew whether his work had reached anyone. In 1900, 16 years after his death, 3 different scientists in 3 different countries independently rediscovered the same mathematical laws of inheritance, and then each of them found Mendel's paper from 1866 sitting in an archive, quiet as a stone, describing everything they thought they had just discovered. He had been right all along. He just never got to know it. Blaise Pascal was 19 years old when he built a calculator. Not a concept, not a drawing, a working mechanical calculator, gears, wheels, a carrying mechanism that could add and subtract numbers automatically. He built it because his father spent his evenings hunched over columns of tax figures, and Pascal could not stand watching him strain. He spent 3 years building 50 prototype versions before he got it right. He was also, at the time, one of the most promising mathematicians in France. At 16, he had written a paper on conic sections that the philosopher René Descartes refused to believe had been written by a teenager. Pascal went on to lay the foundations of probability theory, the mathematics that underlies insurance, statistics, and modern risk analysis, in a series of letters with the mathematician Pierre de Fermat about a dice problem a gambler had brought to them. He did all of this before he turned 30. And yet, if you had asked Blaise Pascal at the end of his life, or the most important night of his life had been not the calculator, not the probability theory, he would not have hesitated. He would have told you about November 23rd, 1654. He was 31 years old. He had been living what his friends called his worldly period, attending salons, spending time with aristocrats and the intellectual elite of Paris. He was restless in a way that success had not fixed. On the evening of November 23rd, sometime between 10:30 at night and half past midnight, something happened to Blaise Pascal in his room in Paris. He never described it in any detail. What we know is what he wrote immediately afterwards, scrawling in a fever on a piece of parchment, then copying it clean onto a second piece once he had steadied his hands. The document he produced is known as the Memorial. It is 273 words long. It begins with one word, written alone at the top of the page, in capital letters. Fire. Then God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Not the God of the philosophers and the scholars. Certainty, certainty, feeling, joy, peace. He is not describing an argument. He is describing 2 hours of something he had no language for, an encounter so overwhelming that the man who had outthought Descartes and baffled Fermat reached for the most ancient, unschooled language he knew. Pay attention to this, because here is what he did next. He folded the parchment. He sewed it into the lining of his coat, not as a keepsake, as a permanent companion. Every morning when he put on his coat, he was putting on the memory of that night. When his coat wore out, he unpicked the stitches carefully and sewed the parchment into the new one. He did this for 8 years. Nobody knew. He died on August 19th, 1662, at 39 years old. After his death, a servant was preparing his coat when a hand along the lining found something stiff, something folded. The servant cut the stitching open. Inside were 2 pieces of parchment, the original, written in the hand of a man trying to hold his pen steady, and the clean copy, written once the trembling had stopped. At the top of both, one word, fire. In the spring of 1927, a quiet Belgian man in a priest's collar walked up to Albert Einstein at a conference in Brussels and told him the universe was expanding. Einstein told him his physics was atrocious. The Belgian man was Georges Lemaitre, 33 years old, a Catholic priest and a professor of physics simultaneously. He had studied at Cambridge, earned a doctorate at MIT, and come back to Belgium to teach physics in the mornings and fulfill his priestly duties in the evenings. In between, he had been working on a problem Einstein himself had quietly stepped around. Einstein's equations of general relativity described the shape of the universe, but when Einstein ran his own equations, they produced an uncomfortable result. The universe was not static. It was either expanding or contracting. Einstein did not like this. He inserted a mathematical term into his equations, specifically to cancel out the expansion and make the universe stand still. Lemaitre removed it. He ran the equations again. He added in the observed data on distant galaxies light shifted toward the red end of the spectrum, indicating those galaxies were moving away. And he concluded, the universe is getting bigger, which means that if you run time backward, everything converges. Everything came from one point, one moment, before which there was nothing. He called it the hypothesis of the primeval atom. We call it the Big Bang. Einstein said his calculations were correct, but his physics was atrocious. Lemaitre thanked him politely and went back to Belgium. By 1931, Einstein had reviewed the data himself and invited Lemaitre to lecture in California. When Lemaitre finished speaking, Einstein stood up in the audience and said in front of the assembled scientists, "This is the most beautiful and satisfying interpretation of creation to which I have ever listened." He also admitted that the mathematical constant he had inserted to keep the universe still was the greatest blunder of his career. But it gets stranger. In November 1951, Pope Pius Roman XII gave an address declaring that modern science had confirmed the opening words of Genesis. The Big Bang was proof of creation. The Pope was delighted. Lemaitre was in the room, and Lemaitre, a Catholic priest, a man whose entire institutional life existed within the church quietly, firmly, asked the Pope not to do that. Not because he doubted Genesis, not because he doubted the Pope, but because he understood something neither a pontiff nor a particle physicist alone could fully see. Science and faith operate in different registers. Science describes how. Genesis describes who and why. To chain them together to say that if the Big Bang is true, then Genesis is proven. And therefore, if the Big Bang is ever revised, then Genesis is threatened, was to put faith at the mercy of the next equation. The Pope listened, and in subsequent addresses, he quietly stopped making the claim. A priest had discovered the beginning of time, and then protected his faith from being too tightly handcuffed to his own discovery. Think about what you have just heard. Think about all six of them together now. Kepler mapping orbits in Prague with failing eyes, and a mother in court for witchcraft. Newton writing 1.5 million words of theology that nobody bothered to publish for 3 centuries. Faraday turning down a knighthood to remain plain mister. Faraday preaching to 50 people on the same Sundays. He was famous across Europe. Mendel dying in a monastery without knowing that the world would eventually catch up to what he found in the garden. Pascal pressing a parchment that began with the word fire against his chest every morning for 8 years. Lemaitre standing in a room with the Pope and saying, "Gently, this is not how faith works." These were not men who kept science in one pocket and faith in the other. They were men for whom the two were not in tension. They were in conversation. The universe was a text. Science was the discipline of reading it. And the author, the bara, the logos, the chokmah was not threatened by the close reading. He had invited it. So what do you do with all of this? Here is the first thing. Every single one of these men was comfortable not having all the answers. Kepler spent 19 years getting the orbit of Mars right. Mendel spent 7 years counting peas, and 34 years waiting for the world to catch up. Newton stood at the edge of the ocean of truth and called himself a boy on the shore. None of them confused their equations for the thing the equations described. They were serious scientists, precisely, because they were humble enough to know that the universe was larger than their current model of it. That is not a scientific virtue. That is a theological one. The fear of the Lord, the Proverbs writer said, is the beginning of wisdom, not terror, but the posture of someone standing before something genuinely larger than themselves. These 6 men had that posture, in the lab, at the desk, in the monastery, garden at dawn. Here is the second thing. Faith did not slow these men down. It accelerated them. Kepler kept calculating through a witchcraft trial, because he believed there was an order underneath the chaos worth finding. Mendel kept crossbreeding pea plants through 7 years of solitary work, because the monastery had given him not just a garden, but a reason to believe that what he found there meant something. Faraday kept showing up to his tiny Sandemanian chapel on the same weekends he was celebrated across Europe, not because the chapel was prestigious, but because it was true. Faith was not the thing they turned to when science ran out. It was the engine underneath the science. Here is the third thing, and this one is for you specifically. Wherever you are watching this, the war between science and faith is largely a war that takes place in headlines and comment sections. It does not take place in the actual lives of the people doing the work. The scientists who go deepest into the structure of the physical world tend not to come back with less wonder. They come back with more. Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project and mapped the entire sequence of human DNA, described looking at the genome for the first time as the most awe-inspiring experience of his scientific life. He became a Christian in his late 20s. He said the evidence of design was not in the gaps in science. It was in the science itself. The logos that John described, the rational, organizing word at the foundation of reality, is either there or it is not. These 6 men looked at the evidence and concluded, each in his own way, that it was there. Not naively, not despite their intelligence, because of it. Blaise Pascal, in the fragments that make up the Pensées, wrote something that has stayed with readers for 360 years. He wrote, "The heart has its reasons of which reason knows nothing." He was not arguing against reason. He had spent his entire life inside it. He was arguing that reason followed far enough, leads you to a door, and what is on the other side of that door is not reached by another equation. It is reached by a step. Kepler took it, Newton took it, Faraday took it, Mendel took it, Pascal took it on the night of November 23rd, 1654, in a room in Paris, and sewed the record of it into his coat. Lemaitre took it, and then stood in a room with the Pope, and said gently that faith does not need science to hold its hand. It can stand on its own. If this video made you think about that door, if it made you want to look at it a little more seriously, then consider subscribing, because this channel exists for exactly that conversation. We are not trying to win an argument. We are trying to look carefully and honestly at the evidence. The universe is very large. It has been here for a very long time, and the men who understood it, best the ones who pressed deepest into the math, and the physics, and the biology, kept finding, at the bottom of everything, something that looked less like an accident, and more like an intention. You do not have to agree with them, but you owe it to yourself to know what they actually found.